we've learned from Turkish newspapers, they're talking about that Turkey has seized all trade with Israel. And we know that they recently they put some restrictions on the export to Israel. Right now, it seems that they're cutting everything. And how do you see the situation right now in Gaza?
Well, I think this is merely the beginning. If this genocide continues, we can expect more such actions. In effect, these are the minimum actions that these countries can take to show their disapproval of Israel and its behavior. They have domestic political reasons to do this. If they don't take some sort of action, they are vulnerable to the charge of hypocrisy, which is leveled against my own country, the United States, with considerable justification. Mr. Blinken has just said that our policy has been consistent. He's absolutely correct, but not in the way that he wants to be. It's absolutely consistent in the sense that we have enabled and continue to enable genocide. We are not taking effective measures to reverse the starvation of people in Gaza. The fact that the floating dock or pier off the coast of Gaza is almost complete will, at the cost of $320 million, will not alleviate the hunger sufficiently. At the same time that happened, a convoy of aid food trucks passing through the Erez crossing into Gaza was attacked by Israeli settlers, and much of the food was lost. So we're dealing with a situation in which Israel and the settler population there remain determined to exterminate or expel everybody in Gaza. No change. And I can understand easily how this evokes outrage, but not just in Muslim countries, but in my own. We have demonstrations now, protests by students throughout the country and now spreading throughout the world. And these students are not motivated by anything but genuine moral indignation. They're not trying to avoid being drafted, as was the case in the Vietnam War and when protests occurred. They are attempting to persuade our country to cease aiding and assisting in a crime, the most horrible crime that international law can find, which is genocide.
You talk about these new demonstrations in the United States. We've seen that Speaker Johnson was talking with the students at the Columbia University. And when you see Speaker Johnson talking with students and repeating the same propaganda by the Netanyahu administration, how do you see this, the understanding on the part of Speaker Johnson and the people in that type of thinking?
Well, I think there is a crisis in the United States more generally, but this is a particular instance of it. And that is that the political elite has lost the confidence of much of the public, and certainly the confidence of young people generally. The society is very polarized. Mr. Johnson can make those statements because there are a large number of Americans who see the world through the eyes of Israeli propaganda. But there are now at least an equal number of people, or perhaps more, who regard that propaganda as utterly false and without merit, and who are, as the students were, angered by the effort that Mr. Johnson made to pretend that nothing was happening. We have a situation in which the United States, Secretary of State Blinken, others in the administration see genocide in Xinjiang in China, where people are being re-educated without being killed. Perhaps forced assimilation is wrong. It is not genocide. And yet they see genocide there and they can detect no evidence of genocide when 442,000 people are murdered and another 120,000 or so are seriously wounded in Gaza with American weapons. What distinguishes the human rights crisis in Gaza from that elsewhere is that the United States is paying for it. You know, as an American, I may very well take issue with the behavior of the Burmese junta in Myanmar to the Rohingya and consider that absolutely improper and verging on genocide, but I'm not paying for it as a taxpayer. I have a right as an American, the students have a right to object to policies that employ resources they contribute or their parents contribute to evil purposes. And that is exactly what is happening.
But how about these new restrictions that the politicians in the United States, they're putting some sort of limits to the talks that people can do? Does it have anything to do with the reality of the United States?
Well, what made the United States the great country that it has been was not only the separation of powers in the government, which limited the power of government over individuals and sub-units of the structure, states, for example. The federal government is a limited government or under the Constitution. But more importantly, the 10 amendments that our ancestors insisted upon enacting to and amending to the Constitution. And the first of these, the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech, the right of the people to assemble, to petition the government for policy changes, has taken a huge blow. The principal enemies of the First Amendment in recent years have been components of the Israel lobby. And basically, they have tried to prohibit any speech or any actions that are opposed to the state of Israel. This latest legislation reminds me of Humpty Dumpty, the famous character who fell off the wall. Humpty Dumpty in Alice in Wonderland, I believe, says words can mean anything I want them to mean. Well, anti-Semitism, that is not the same as anti-Zionism. And people who object to genocide or the conduct of that by a foreign government cannot be called anti-Semitic. That is not the best illustration of this, I think, was in Boston, where there were a couple of people with large Israeli flags who joined a pro-Palestinian protest and yelled, "Kill the Jews." And they were condemned and shuffled out of the demonstration by the demonstrators, the protesters, who are not anti-Semitic. They are in favor of human rights. They are in favor of international law. They are in favor of human decency. And if it is anti-Semitic to be in favor of those in favor of those things, then we're all in deep trouble. So I think the action of the Congress was absolutely shameful and a disgusting spectacle for anybody who believes in constitutional order and freedom of speech.
When it comes to the Democratic Party, how do you see the situation at the end of the day? Do you think, are they trying to modify their policy in Gaza? With all that said, with these demonstrations, we know most of these people who are against this type of policy, most of them are voting Democrats. They're not in favor of Republicans mostly. And how do you see the Democratic Party treating this issue?
I think the Democratic Party is a coalition of many forces. It lacks the intense unity that Republicans bring to politics, and it is flaking apart. Components of the Democratic coalition are in search of some way to defect. I mean, they are not at all attracted to Mr. Trump or the Republican Party as it now appears, a sort of pro-Trump cult rather than a broad-based political party. They're not at all attracted to that. They oppose it. But that does not mean that they are going to remain in the Democratic fold. Many people are looking for an alternative in 2024 elections to Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. Unfortunately, our system is designed, as it turns out, to buttress a two-party system. That has been a source of strength in the past. It's now a source of dissension. And in many ways, the United States, I think, shows the world what people might call a pre-revolutionary condition. That is to say, the number of people who are satisfied and who think the country is moving in the right direction are about 20%, only 20%. Everybody else is disgusted and unhappy with the direction of events, but for different reasons. And some are on the side of Mr. Trump, who argues to make America great again in what I could only call ultranationalist or chauvinist terms. Others are in favor of making America great again by returning to the traditions of our constitutional order and freedom of speech. And there is a battle going on between these two sides. And it cannot be explained in terms of Republicans versus Democrats. I think the young people who are demonstrating, who are protesting, are looking for a political party they can support. And they cannot support the Democratic Party under Mr. Biden, who might as well, for most purposes, be a member of the Israeli war cabinet in terms of his decisions. The only peace candidate that I have been able to discover is, in fact, Dr. Stein. She is very sound on quite a number of issues. One doesn't have to agree with everything she advocates or espouses to see that in terms of US foreign policy, she represents a view that the protesting students would find very congenial. And I think she will get a lot more votes in this election than many people imagine. Unfortunately, given the two-party structure of our politics, if Mr. Biden does not drop out and if he is not replaced by a more credible candidate, I think we can look forward to the election of Donald Trump. I think you had an experience in Brazil, the Jair Bolsonaro, which was not very comforting. And I think the United States will suffer greatly if we have a vindictive, erratic, ignorant president like Trump back in office.
Just shifting the gear to what has happened in China, Antony Blinken's recent visit to China, in which he was trying to convince Chinese not to help Russia. At the same time, they're helping Taiwan against China. How do you see the logic behind this trip when you evaluate?
Well, this trip seems to have been for the purpose of having a meeting. A meeting is its own purpose. This is similar to what our military call a self-licking ice cream cone. It is its own justification. And in fact, the Department of State, in previewing the trip, all but said that nothing would be accomplished by it except to keep open lines of communication, a meeting for the sake of having a meeting. And indeed, nothing was accomplished during this visit, except perhaps the further alienation of the Chinese, because they have not signed on to subordination to the United States. They do not support the unilateral sanctions the United States and other members of the G7 have imposed. They have a normal trade relationship with Russia. They have refrained from sending weapons to Russia. They have, however, allowed the Russians to buy components with which to build their own weapons. The United States is trying to stop that. There is absolutely no reason, given the fact that the United States is arming the enemy of Russia in Ukraine and arming the enemy of China in Taiwan, and putting pressure on Iran and has not come up with a formula for peace in Korea, which threatens Chinese security interests, there is, I think, in the Chinese view, absolutely no reason that they would want to cooperate with Mr. Blinken. Mr. Blinken, in gardening terms, there are some people who have so-called green thumbs. Everything they touch grows well. And there are some people who have black thumbs. Anything they touch dies. Mr. Blinken has a black thumb when it comes to diplomacy. I cannot see anything he has accomplished in office other than the alienation of much of the world. He is continuing to behave like the congressional staffer he was. That is, he talks about foreign policy only in terms of influencing domestic political views. He talks at people rather than with them. He does not show any empathy, any understanding of other people's viewpoints. And I think he's certainly the most inept diplomat on the planet at the moment. And I would happily trade him for the foreign minister of many other countries if such a trade were possible. But I'm not in charge, and I can't arrange such a transaction.
When you talk about Blinken, I remember recently he had just 2-3 months ago, he was asked why we couldn't bring Russia to its knees in Ukraine, despite all of those sanctions from the United States, from the European Union. His answer was quite amazing for me, because he said that because the world is changing and we have to study this changing that is happening right now. If he accepts, he endorses that the world is changing, why they're not changing their policy and they're doing the same, what they did to Russia, they're doing the same to China?
Well, there's very little explanation for that, except obtuseness and a lack of intelligence, perhaps. I mean, he should understand the world has changed. How has it changed? In many ways. First of all, the perception of Russia as weak and militarily ineffective was wrong. I don't think if he had asked the American intelligence community for their judgment, they would have agreed with that judgment. But that was his judgment. That is a domestic, politically convenient judgment, and it has no bearing in reality. Second, with regard to the global majority, or certainly the global South, but I would say the global majority, people want what I would call a multinodal, not a multipolar order. I'll explain that in a minute. But they don't want a single hegemon or two hegemons or three hegemons. They want respect for their sovereignty and their ability to make decisions in a world where people can deal with whoever they wish on whatever terms they wish and not be subject to bullying by anyone else. And so if you look at the world that way, Russia is an essential component of a multinodal world. If there's no Russia, then countries like Brazil or South Africa or Nigeria or the Arab world, or for that matter, Europe, are faced with American hegemony or a contest between the United States and China, rather than the opportunity to participate in a more democratic, flexible, open arrangement. Now, why do I say multinodal rather than multipolar? You're an engineer, I understand. Nodes have three-dimensional connections, and they can connect many things. That is the definition of a node. And a node functions in a network, and a network is not the same thing as a linear linear axis. Pole is the end of a straight line. We have a North Pole, we have a South Pole. They are united by a line that passes through the center of the Earth. But international relations are not a single axis. There is no you're with us or against us. You have to recognize that you may have very bad political relationships with a country, but you may also have a good economic relationship with it. You may have a bad economic relationship, but not necessarily have a military confrontation. You may have a military confrontation, which we do with China, and yet have a very vigorous economic relationship, and so forth. So I prefer the word nodes to poles, because I think the world is getting connected in different ways. And in order to function in this world, you have to have the mental flexibility to say, well, I disagree completely with Mr. Putin on X, Y, or Z, but I can cooperate with him on A, B, and C. If you cannot do that, then you are floundering into the kind of morass that Mr. Blinken failed to recognize.
Do you think that we know that if the United States start sanctioning China the way they did to Russia, that would be a huge loss on the part of the European Union? They are so much connected with China right now.
It's not possible. Part of the problem here is that the existing American foreign policy establishment, sometimes called the blob, seems to imagine that containment can be reenacted. Now, containment was a policy adopted at the suggestion of George Kennan, who was a very brilliant man and student of Russia. And he concluded that if Russia were walled off because it was an autarkic country, meaning self-reliant, self-sufficient, it would eventually perish. The system would come down of it as a result of its own defects. So he was right. It took 40 years, but that happened. But Russia was a society with many deep problems. And it was, as I said, autarkic, meaning self-reliant, self-sufficient, not connected to the rest of the world. China is everyone's largest trading partner. 36% of manufactures on this planet now take place in China. 36%. The United States is about 1/3 of that. So I think we need to recognize that the world is much more complex than it was in 1945, 1947, 1948, when the Cold War was gestated. This is not the world we live in. It is absolutely impossible to do to China what we did to the Soviet Union, and it would be irrelevant, because even though many in the West seem to hope that China will stumble and fall, its system is remarkably effective and successful. And one may dislike its political system, as I do, frankly, but at the same time recognize that it produces competent leaders who can make decisions, who can produce strategies, who can implement those strategies at a time when we in the West, and I include your own country, Latin American countries in the West, seem to have a great deal of difficulty producing strategies and even more difficulty sticking to them.
They want to send more weapons, more aid to Ukraine. And at the same time, we are witnessing that in Georgia, there are some political movements, and some sort of color revolution in Georgia. How dangerous is that when we put these two conflicts together in Ukraine and in Georgia?
Well, I think Georgia stands on its own and is not really connected to Ukraine anymore. It was connected to Ukraine because when NATO invited Georgia and Ukraine to join it in 2008, the immediate response was a war between Russia and Georgia. Why? Russia was trying to signal that it was very serious in its opposition to further NATO enlargement, and that it was prepared to go to war to stop it. And that was why, and the West ignored that lesson. And so we got into the strange position of opposing any negotiation of European security architecture or the neutralization, return to neutrality of Ukraine, which was, after all, became independent with a pledge of neutrality. And we could not implement the accords by which Russian speakers in Ukraine would have had a measure of autonomy under the agreements negotiated in Belarus, so at Minsk. I think the issues are very different. Why is the United States continuing to pump weapons into Ukraine? Let me say, first of all, that it took us a very long time to produce that aid, and that is not reassuring to anyone. I don't think it rescued the American reputation for reliability because it took so long. And Ukraine is really on its last legs now. The amount of weapons that will go in and the timing of them will not enable Ukraine to go on the offensive and will not be enough, in my view, to enable it to hold the line against Russian advances. That is the first point. The second point is there are different political calculations here. On the Republican side, there is the ultra-nationalist, neoconservative philosophy, which some people like Victoria Nuland represent. And therefore, many Republicans, once Mr. Trump withdrew his objections to aid for Ukraine, were prepared to go ahead with it. On the Democratic side, I think it was more cynical. They don't want Ukraine to completely collapse before November and the elections. They want to push this issue off into the next administration's hands. I think it is actually quite plausible that Ukraine will not last until the November elections for many reasons. There are many Ukrainians who understand that there must now be a negotiated end to this war. Mr. Zelensky is a principal obstacle to that because he is adamant that there can be no negotiations. And in fact, he has promulgated a law that makes negotiations impossible. That's got to go. Well, maybe Mr. Zelensky will be a victim of his own intransigence. And we will have another government in Kyiv, which will be more inclined to recognize reality rather than deny it.
Recently, Jens Stoltenberg said that when the time is right, Ukraine will become a NATO member. Do you think he's still talking the talk, or is there any sort of strategy behind that?
Well, there's clearly no strategy. You must be talking politics. I think this is a question of face for the Biden administration. After all, it provoked a war with Russia on precisely this issue. The Russians said, Ukraine cannot be part of NATO. We said, of course it will be. And the Russians then did what we said they were going to do, which was mount an invasion of Ukraine. I think this is utterly unrealistic and deserves to be dismissed as political rhetoric.
I don't know if you saw, there is a new video coming out of Ukraine that shows that Ukrainian army is burning Donald Trump's picture, and unbelievable how they're getting involved in the domestic policy of the United States, and what's the necessity of doing this, in your opinion, on the part of Ukrainians?
Well, I'm sure it's sincere feelings on their part, since Mr. Trump has made no secret of his intention to pull the plug on this war. You know, this war in many ways resembles the war that Athens launched against Syracuse, which was disastrous for the Athenians. This is proving to be a strategic defeat of major proportions. It has done huge reputational damage to the United States and the members of the G7. It has divided NATO in the end, not united it. It has brought Finland and Sweden into NATO, where they now can apparently count on the United States to do for them what they once did for themselves. namely maintain an adequate defense. Finland and Sweden have always been strong militarily. The incentive for them to continue to spend the same amount of money on defense may be lessened rather than increased. Walter Lippmann, a great American journalist many years ago, almost 100 years ago, said that an alliance is only as strong as its weakest link, like a chain. Again, an engineering metaphor. And I think this is true. And there are many weak links now in NATO. When Mr. Sullivan says NATO will accept Ukraine, he is paying no attention to politics in Slovakia and Hungary and other countries in Europe where this is not regarded as a wise move. And there is a further question because of the desire to keep the war going, apparently not to save Ukraine or Ukrainians, but to injure and punish Russia. We are supplying weapons that will shoot farther into Russia. The only result of that will be that the Russians shoot back at, I hope, just Ukraine and not more widely. So the issue now is how much of Ukraine will survive? If the Russian offensives, which are building, succeed, if Russia, as some suggest, now considers the Dnieper River as its strategic frontier, then I think Ukraine may end up landlocked and crippled. And as I've said before, it is not qualified for membership in the EU at present. It would have to undergo major reform and a cure for the immense corruption of its society, which has been aggravated by the war. Wars always foster corruption, and Ukraine has been no exception. So I think we're coming to a point where we need to make some hard decisions and not do what Mr. Sullivan has been doing, which is engage in denial and happy talk that is totally unjustified.
Do you think that they're waiting, they're helping Ukraine just to keep fighting Russia up until the next, until the 2024 presidential election is over, that we know that there is Donald Trump can win 2024. He has a good chance of winning this election. And they're going to put it on Trump that this war was lost because of Trump. This war in Ukraine was lost because of Trump.
That's all too plausible. This issue is far too partisan and polarizing. I think the desire of American politicians to evade all responsibility for the consequences their actions and decisions produce is almost infinite. So people in power are very happy to hand the mess they've made to the next group. You know, there is this saying in the country to yourself, Dios rearregla de noche lo que hacen los argentinos de día. You know, and maybe in this case, it's not God, it's my successor will have to deal with the mess that I have made.
Yeah. We know that there is a new attitude in the African countries that they ask the United States to withdraw the troops from Niger, from Chad. And right now, Antony Blinken, we've seen that he was visiting Saudi Arabia. He was talking with Arabs that they need an integrated air defense system against Iran. And when it comes to the policy that they had in Africa is just defeated. That policy is gone. There was no strategy behind it in Africa. Right now, they're doing the same in the Middle East.
Well, let me make a couple of comments first about Africa, with which I'm very familiar. I was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa for about 4 years. I think Africans want to be a great power contest-free zone. They do not want the United States or China or Russia or anyone else, European colonial powers, or even Brazil to come in and contest for dominance of their countries or their region. And I don't think it's strange at all that Niger and Chad have expelled the French, and they now wish to get rid of the United States. And I think the Chinese and others are, maybe not the Russians, who seem to be taking advantage of the vacuum, but I think at least the Chinese are too clever to get caught up in this kind of great power rivalry in Africa. And I would say finally that about Africa, that the United States did not have an Africa command, meaning a military organization devoted to the security of African countries until quite recently. And it should not have been established, because American relationships with Africa, in my view, should be focused on economic and political development, not on military matters. Those are things that the countries of Africa should handle on their own without our participation. So that's on Africa. On the Middle East, the effort to create, sorry, the effort to create an integrated air defense system goes back many decades. When I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia, that was one of our objectives. And again, the enemy was Iran. And later, the enemy was Iraq. And we always hoped that the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC countries, could integrate their air defenses, but they have not done so. And there are many reasons for why they have not done so. These are countries that are very jealous of their independence from each other, as well as from the outside world and from Iran. And I think the trend now is, if the idea, as I'm sure it is, Mr. Blinken's idea is that the United States would provide the coordination of such an integrated defense system, I think that moment has passed. The countries of the Arab countries of West Asia are now interested in diversifying their international relationships, not putting all their chips in one basket for the United States or China. And finally, I don't think China wants to dominate the region. I think what China wants is what the United States wanted for most of the period of our relationship with the region, namely assured access to energy supplies and a market for our goods and services. And I don't think the Chinese have shown any interest at all. They sell weapons, but they don't show any interest at all in taking responsibility for the defense of the countries in the region. That is now a unique American characteristic. So I think we make a mistake. We imagine that China is predatory, is trying to establish itself in the Middle East against us. No, I think the countries in the region are trying to reach out to China, to India, to Russia, to Brazil, for all that matter, to try to diversify their relationships with major countries in order to maintain their independence, or I should say, achieve greater independence than they have had under the dominance of the United States. I don't think they want to be dominated by anybody. And I also, finally, I note that they have made a sort of peace with Iran. They have recognized Iran's power. They have recognized that their past efforts to reduce Iran's influence in places like Syria have failed. I don't think they're quite reconciled to the current situation in Lebanon, but they have begun to normalize relations with the Bashar al-Assad government in Damascus. And they understand that they need to have a cordial and cooperative relationship with Iran rather than an antagonistic one if they are not to suffer. They have learned that through their experience with the Houthis and with Hezbollah. And I don't think they are interested in placing themselves under the American wing to the extent that Mr. Blinken imagines. Now, finally, I would note that his statements about this are all connected to what I regard as essentially an effort to divert attention from the genocide in Gaza and focus it on Saudi-Israeli normalization, which, if it were possible before October 7th, is clearly not possible now. And as I've said to you before, I think the Saudis have been playing this to see what they can get from the United States, given the peculiar American fronting for Israel, pursuit of Israeli rather than American interests. And so they've demanded a defense treaty, which has no prospect of going through the United States Senate. They've demanded access to the full nuclear fuel cycle, which has no chance of being approved by the US Congress, or for that matter, Israel. And they have demanded a Palestinian state, either in being or irrevocably committed to by Israel. And Mr. Netanyahu makes it clear, and I think he's speaking for the vast majority of Israelis, that the last thing on earth they will accept is that. So all this is a political posturing aimed at campaign donations in the United States. I don't regard it as serious diplomacy, because one thing you should do when you try to conduct diplomacy is be realistic about what is feasible and what is not. And this is not.
We know that prior to October 7th, Israel wanted to normalize its relationship with Saudi Arabia. In that accords, there were no mentioning of two-state solution in.
Yeah, this is why. Now, please note that when the so-called Abraham Accords were achieved, the United Arab Emirates insisted on a halt to settlement activity in recognition of Palestinian right of self-determination. If Israel agreed to those things, it has done the opposite. So there's a real question. If you were a Saudi and you got an assurance from the Israelis that, yeah, we'll look at a two-state solution, would you believe them? I don't think anybody would believe them.
Right now, it seems that they're putting this two-state solution in the courts if Israel is willing to negotiate with Saudi Arabia. And do you think is the Netanyahu administration, or will the Netanyahu administration be able to remove this adding two-state solution in the courts?
No. His cabinet will not allow that. He will not allow that. He has spent his entire career trying to prevent Palestinian self-determination. That is his purpose now. That is the purpose of the extremists who populate the cabinet. If he were to try to do that, they would throw him out. And if he's thrown out, he will spend some time in jail for corruption, very likely. He is also, by the way, I should note, he and others, including the extremists who have him prisoner, a political prisoner, are now on the verge, very likely, of being indicted as war criminals by the International Criminal Court. Something he's very concerned about. He got on television and made the most remarkable, unbelievable statement about Israelis being victims, and this is anti-Semitism, and and so forth and so on. Well, the fact is that if you criticize a country that is committing genocide and you call that anti-Semitism, then everybody in the world is anti-Semitic. You cannot escape the consequences of what you do. So I would say to be anti-Zionist now is a global majority opinion, a very strong one, that does not imply anti-Semitism. The only thing that can produce anti-Semitism is the reflexive, unanimous, unreasoned support of some Jews around the world for the state of Israel and what it is doing. Most Jews, I think, around the world, do not want to be associated with what Israel is doing, and understand And they don't want to be associated with what Israel is doing, not only because they understand that would lead to anti-Semitism and have a consequence for them, but because they are moral people. They are people of conscience. They're not bad people. And what they see their fellow Jews or so-called Jews in Israel doing, I think they're Zionists, not Jews. I think they are idolaters, like the worshippers of the golden calf, not people with an unseen God. And so I think Mr. Netanyahu, in many ways, and this group of people are committing national suicide without the support of the world, including, but not exclusively, the large number of Jews in North America and elsewhere. Israel can't survive. And the better people in Israel are people who do have a conscience and who are interested in living in a democracy with the rule of law. Many of them have been leaving. And so have many of the people of European descent rather than Middle Eastern descent. The Ashkenazi group, the European Jews, and the Mizrahim, the Arab Jews, divide Israel. And the worst actors now, in fact, are Arab Jews. With the exception of Mr. Netanyahu, who is not. So I think Israel is beginning to fall apart. Its economy is in tatters. Its society is divided. Its government is unprecedentedly unpopular. Its actions alienate the entire world. It is becoming a true international pariah. It is in danger of being accused of the very things that Jews fled to Israel to avoid, namely genocide, mass murder, and this sort of thing. And this is not a pretty picture. And as someone who has always hoped that Israel would live up to the original ideals that its founders proclaimed, this is a matter of great distress to me, as it is to many other people.
Just to wrap up this session, we know that Netanyahu is insisting on his policy to attack Rafah, and he's not. At the end of the day, it seems that he's going to attack. And do you think, when it comes to his strategy, do you think he sees this as his final chance of surviving in the political arena of Israel? Because we know that most of the people, 78%, new polls show 78% of the people in Israel support this policy in Gaza. He's trying to be connected with those people by this attack on Rafah.
Yes, I think he's been fairly consistent. He puts his own career and his own ego ahead of the values and future of his country. As I suggested, I think what he is doing is leading Israel toward a kind of suicide. But he doesn't care. He cares about himself. He doesn't care about the hostages either. That's pretty clear. He's not prepared to make compromises to save them. He did that with a negotiation with Hamas once. That is the only significant release of hostages that has occurred. So I think, yes, his intention is to depopulate Gaza, and he will do that however he can. Whether he can do it by driving Palestinians out of Gaza, by starving them to death, or by bombing and shooting them, he doesn't care. So yes, he will do the invasion of Rafah. And I think that will be a step too far in terms of international opinion. And it will be the straw that broke the camel's back.
Do you think that at the end of the day, after attacking Rafah, how this situation of Israel in Europe, in the United States, here in South America, China, Russia, would change? How does that affect the position of Israel?
Well, you mentioned the Turkish decision to cut off all trade. I think we're headed for something far more international, universal, and punitive than the measures applied to South Africa. Israel is making itself the skunk at the garden party. I don't know if you have skunks in Brazil. You probably don't, but you must know what they are. And it's not going to be welcome in any context. And I think Israelis are going to find that when they announce that they're Israeli, people look at them as though they were Nazis. You know, this six-pointed Star of David, which was a symbol of Jewish renewal and in a state of Israel, is now looked on by much of the world the same way Europeans look at the swastika. It's a symbol of genocide. Well, that is not anything anybody should celebrate. But I think this goes to the fact that, in a way, it goes back to the slur of anti-Semitism, which Israelis routinely apply to anyone who criticizes them. What this means is that they never hear any criticism. So they live in a little bubble in which their own prejudices go unchallenged. And now the world is prepared to challenge those. And kids are on the streets everywhere, not against Israel, against genocide. But I think that could easily turn into against Israel. And in my own country, it could turn into a general anti-war movement. We will see.